Quiet, please. In exactly 15 seconds, we'll be on the air.
Kia ora, nani hi o te rā, and my pleasure to introduce Ruth, who, along with Geoff Blackwell, has created 200 Women. So welcome, Ruth. Welcome to Groove FM.
Thank you, Tim. Nice to be here.
Now, tell me first, how did you and Geoff come to this project?
A bit of a long story. We've kind of been working together making books for 20 years and travelling around the world. And one of the places that we've visited a lot is South Africa. We've been fortunate enough to make 4 books with Nelson Mandela and various other heroes there like Archbishop Tutu. And, always just sort of taken aback by the incredible inequality that exists in that country and the amazing things they've done to overcome that. And just kind of grew from there, really, just wanting to try and kind of spread a message about equality or the lack of it and, how we can take a positive message out to the world.
And I noticed that there's quite a lot of African voices in this particular book. It covers off some remarkable people like, I'm just going to jump straight to it, and we'll talk about Zelda Lagrange, who...
Oh, she's amazing. Yeah, she's actually become a really good friend, and her story is quite amazing because she's so honest and upfront about the fact that she was brought up in an Afrikaner background, and she was actually brought up to think that, Black people were inferior to white people. And so her transition to become basically, Mandela's closest trusted confidant and friend was quite extraordinary. And she credits him totally and utterly with opening her eyes and educating her and totally changing her view of the world.
So her chance meeting when she went to work in his office, and the way he spoke to her pretty much turned her around. Revelation. Yeah,
completely. I mean, she was literally this sort of young woman in the typing pool. And when the outgoing government vacated the presidential offices, I mean, it was quite extraordinary. They pretty much took everything with them. I mean, they had Mandela and his team walked in, and there wasn't even any crockery. Like they'd taken everything, and they had to start again. And he was kind of just walking through and just saw this young woman, and he was very aware of the power of symbolism, and he knew that if he picked a white Afrikaans woman to be his assistant, that would send a really strong message to the Afrikaner community about his wanting to have this spirit of inclusiveness in his new government going forward.
Wow, that is incredible. I don't even know if you could do that again anywhere.
I know, I don't think you could. And she tells the story, the thing that really took her aback was the fact he spoke to her in her own language, and that was not something she expected. And I think from that moment on, she was sold.
Yeah, which is interesting because I guess he would have picked up quite a bit of that probably in prison or something. So the resentment and the kind of oppression that would have gone with that would have been something very difficult to turn around.
Yeah, well, they kind of, in prison, they used to call Robben Island a university because they used to say, everyone went in there uneducated and came out with a degree. And one of the things that they were very big on was basically you need to speak the language of your oppressor. You cannot actually enter into meaningful dialogue unless you're both speaking the same language. And clearly the authorities weren't about to turn around and start learning how to speak Zulu or Xhosa. So, they didn't really have a choice.
So that pretty much sums that. That's a metaphor of, I can't even think of the words to go with that. It's just too good.
Yeah.
Let's look at, so you travelled around. How many countries did you actually end up going to?
Oh my goodness, I don't even know. I didn't go on all of them, and neither did Geoff. We kind of had this team that we put together. We had a travelling team. We had a photographer, Kieran Scott, whose images are just extraordinary, and he's just done, honestly, the most amazing job and the most incredible person to work with. So we had him, and his son was actually doing all the videography. And then we always had either Geoff or myself, or we had an American editor, Sharon Gelman, and we had a European editor, Marianne Lissandro. So, we kind of had this interchangeable travelling team. Obviously, our European editor was very helpful because she speaks English, French and Italian. And our German publisher helped us out in Germany. But, a lot of places we went to, we had on-the-ground people that helped us out because quite a lot of the time we were interviewing through translators, which is a puts a whole different spin on doing an interview, as I'm sure you can imagine.
I can imagine that, and trying to get the articulation across without losing the voice.
It's quite difficult to, a lot of the interviews are incredibly emotional. When these women really opened up, they trusted us, they took us into their confidence, and some of the stories they told were just so incredibly powerful, where, everyone in the room was crying. It was just so emotional. And then you have the double thing of the translation. Sometimes I have a situation where the translator would start crying, and I didn't know why they were crying. I just knew that it was going to be a really compelling answer. It was quite an extraordinary experience.
Wow. 200 women, how many, but there was more than that, wasn't there? How many would have ended up on the cutting room floor, so to speak?
Nobody ended up on the cutting room floor. What we wanted to do was actually make sure that we could make each edition more relevant to its own market. In order to get a strong message across, you have to actually include women that the potential reader is going to identify with. So we interviewed 224 altogether, and we have, for example, more Americans in the American edition, more Australians in the Australian edition, more South Africans in the South African edition, and so on and so on. Just because I think it's really important that there's about 50 women in each edition that are probably well known, or the reader will know of or have heard of, and what we wanted to do was use those 50 stories to help illuminate the other 150 who, without the famous voices, wouldn't have a chance to be heard. So that was one of our key factors in deciding, who we were going to approach to be in the book.
What struck me about it was like you said, the 50 names, some big, some small. The diversity in the Kiwi version. We have Lydia Ko in there, who's probably, the New Zealand's best-known golfer that's still currently going, but then an American High Court judge face was
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Exactly, and her face was so familiar to me. There's the Pussy Riot former, there's women rights activists, like Ina Moja, who was out here for WOMAD last year.
Oh, she's amazing.
She was, yeah. There was Margaret Atwood, who everyone knows.
Yep.
Now, or even better now, thanks to the...
and there's also like some women, we didn't even know that they were going to be at the sort of forefront of the zeitgeist, but Margaret Atwood's one of them. Ashley Judd is another one. And when we interviewed her, she actually, this gives me chills now thinking back, but she told in her interview the story of being raped as a young woman trying to make it in acting. And I sit here now and I think, God, was that actually Harvey Weinstein that she was talking about?
Isn't that strange?
Yeah, because she's since come out and accused him of rape. And I think, is that story that she was telling us? Were we the beginning of her actually getting her voice and coming out and saying these things?
Yeah, and there's a very strong feminist in there. I can't remember her name, but she, when you asked her one of the questions, she said, "What would you change?" She said, "Men silent for a year," and I just thought,
yeah.
Why did I think that was a good thing? I'm amazed. I really like the idea of that.
Well, there is a school of thought that is like, well, men have actually been doing this for 3,000 years. You've been in charge and not quite sure that we've done a great job. So let's give the women a shot for a while and see what happens. But I don't think that's actually not our message. Our message, I think we really very much want to say this, we have to do this together. This is not, I always say this is not a book about women's rights. It's a book about human rights, and we're all human.
I did notice that. I also noticed that there's some very personal stories in there. There's one woman who's photographed after breast cancer, and she's barely holding, but she wants to show her scars. It's not a badge, but it's definitely part of her story. That photo needs to be that way. Yeah.
Well, she's quite a well-known actress, and I think she's English. I can't remember if she's English or lives in America or vice versa. But we didn't start out like that. I mean, we just would like, here's an interview, and she turned up and she was, wearing a beautiful white shirt, and then kind of as we got into the interview, she said, can you hang on a second? And she basically went away and came out, and she was just wearing a robe, and she said, I want you to photograph me as I am, my scar and what I've gone through. Wow. So she just arrived at that by herself, and you could only have arrived at that moment with it being her idea. We would never have asked, but of course it was, again, really powerful.
Definitely was. I think that photo, it's in a way, although I don't know anyone myself who's gone through that, I can relate to it just because it's part of the community we're in.
Yeah, that's right.
I think it's something quite common that you're going to see along with these other stories. In fact, actually, a lot of these stories seem very familiar to me in many ways. There wasn't many surprises there. I hadn't encountered a lot of news stories in that sense, but they're all personal, very very poignant. I wondered if the 5 questions that you created, were they a way of looking to try and find or test some kind of homogeneity, for example, or a common theme, some kind of sense of difference, or was it just...
No, well, it was a variety of reasons, but the key one being is that actually we wanted to place all of the contributors in a democratic space. So so we had the 5 questions that were always exactly the same, and they're designed to find out about the person and what matters to them, basically. But also the way we photographed them, we put them all against a plain canvas backdrop, so that your focus is just on them. If you have a wealthy, well-known American actress sitting in her house in Hollywood, and you have that background, you're going to have a whole different subset of preconceived ideas versus, a goat herder from Nepal sitting on a mud floor. So the idea was to put them in this democratic space so that they're all from the same starting point, and that we can truly just focus on them and not their environment, not their background, not any preconceived ideas about who they are. That was the kind of main reason behind it.
Yeah, and I was reminded yesterday I was reading the weekend papers, and there was an article about women who either chose not to have children or couldn't have children, and I noticed that they had taken different paths. But in Western society, and also I read in the lines of this book as well, that's a common theme as well, is that women are kind of judged by their fertility still in that sense. And I noticed that there was definitely a theme in here about women who have kind of overcome this. It's not a prejudice, but a kind of preconceived idea to be who they were.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that I came across was just this whole thing of there's a massive correlation between inequality and poverty, and where you have lack of education and lack of resources, it's always women that lose out, because if they don't have education, they don't have the ability to earn their own living and be financially independent. And if they, alongside that, as if they're not educated, they can't be physically independent, so they're not in control of their own body, which means that you're constantly, your life circumstance or your life situation is dictated by your fertility, and the less money you have and the less education you have, the less control you have over that fertility, and therefore your independence for your whole life. It's just, just one thing after another. And I think that in order to truly have equality, we have to get to a point where women are allowed to have control over their body, because that is the only way that they can be truly independent.
Was there any story? Was there any story in the book that you were just overwhelmed by? That you just think, well, that tops it.
There were so many, to be honest. There were the one that stopped me in my tracks actually was June Steenkamp, who's the mother of Reva Steenkamp, who was murdered by Oscar Pistorius. And she, when we asked her words, the last question is, what single word do you most identify with? And she just looked me just straight in the eye and said, death. And I just was completely speechless. I had goosebumps, and I was so stunned, because I just thought, this poor woman who's, lost her daughter, and now her single most word that she identifies with for the rest of her life is death. And it's so shocking that you almost have a brain freeze, because she's sitting there in front of you as this, living, breathing person who actually is now spending her time to campaign against violence against women, but that's still her wakes up in the morning, goes to bed at night with that thought. That was pretty, yeah, it was pretty chilling.
And that was around her. It wasn't that this is something I must avoid.
No, that was just like, this now defines my life.
Oh.
Yeah, it was pretty, and there were lots of other stories where you think there could be, you know, there's interviewed like women in India who've been rescued from the sex trade and just horrific stories, but that one for some reason just got to me because I just thought, it was without hesitation she said it, and it was just quite sort of, I just kind of felt this immediate huge sense of sorrow for her that had become her defining kind of mantra.
Wow. Take a breath.
Oh, yes, sorry.
That's okay. I wanted to try the 5 questions out on you, if that's okay.
Oh, my goodness, that's quite scary.
Yes. So, number 1 you asked everybody was, what really matters to you? So, 2 sentences.
2 sentences.
Yes.
I think it probably goes back to what I was talking about before. So what really matters to me is education and opportunity. I think if everybody had the opportunity for education, it does so much to give people freedom in their lives going forward. It gives them economic independence. It gives them all sorts of independence. I think it's massively important. So to me, that's what matters to me.
Okay, and number 2 question, what brings you happiness?
What brings me happiness? What brings me happiness is, I suppose, bringing people together and connection, and like, for example, being able to work on this project and bring all these women together. They've almost now feel like they're in this big international family. So we've joined up these 200 women who now feel like they're connected, and that brings me happiness.
Wow. And number 3, what do you regard as the lowest depth of despair?
Lowest depth of misery for me would probably be lack of liberty. I think to lose your liberty is, I think most of us in countries like New Zealand don't know how lucky we are. Lack of liberty would be it.
And what would you change if you could?
What I would change if I could, probably goes back to that education thing again. If everybody had a chance at education, it's not a privilege, it's a right, and we need to fight for it, because with education comes the opportunity for everything else: freedom, democracy, financial independence. And
you know the last question I'm going to ask.
What single word do I most identify with? I had to think about this. I got asked this a couple of weeks ago, and weirdly, I know it sounds trite, but for me, the word is word, because I'm a publisher, I'm an editor, I trade in words, I deal in words, and words can heal, words can hurt, but ultimately words are about communication, and they're vitally important.
That definitely sums it up beautifully. Thank you so much for your time. This is a fantastic book. I've only started to delve into it, but I'm a father with 3 girls and my wife in the house as well, plus 2 cats who are both females. So I feel I'm coming from one side of the fence on this one, and I'm really enjoying that. Oh, good. I'm glad you're enjoying it, and I hope that it's inspiring for your whole family. It certainly has been, and it will be for our listeners and readers as well. So thank you so much for your time. Oh, it's been lovely to talk to you, Tim. Thank you so much. Now, one last question, just before I let you go. How can we find out more about the conversation? You can go to 200women.com. So that's spelled out in words, TWOHURDRED.com. And there's lots of things there. There's videos, there's interviews with all the women, profiles on all the women, and lots and lots of information that hopefully your listeners will enjoy. Thank you so much for your time, Ruth, and all the best with the next projects you take on. Thank you, Tim.